I don't know where I saw the notice that you guys were putting together this program. It was on one of the standard outlets, maybe Wall Street Journal, maybe Bloomberg. But I read an article that you were putting together this forecasting tournament and that you were trying to find out what it is makes a good forecaster. And I feel like I owe the system. For so many years, I've been doing research, and I've relied on other people to contribute to that research, and they have selflessly. And so I'm a chronic volunteer as well. When somebody says, I need your help to do my research, I volunteer. For instance, the New York Blood Center contacted me and said, you're not allowed to give blood, but we've got this research program in blood donation. Will you come in and donate a pint of blood every month so we can see what happens? So I did that, just to pay back the system. So I'm paying back the system by being in the Good Judgment Project. I think that I make connections. For instance, I couldn't figure out why Putin was in Syria. None of the explanations that people gave, the talking heads, made any sense to me. Syria does not adjoin Russia. The Ukraine does. Syria is of no strategic importance to Putin. Why is he in Syria? There was just no reason. All of this business about how he couldn't let one of his henchmen down or else all the other henchmen would feel insecure, I just didn't buy that. I wanted to make sense of that, and all of a sudden, I remembered something, and that is that Putin is building up the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean, but they don't have a home port in the Mediterranean, so they have to go all the way back to Russia and the Black Sea to get a home port. Well, where is Putin landing his troops? Next to the port of Latakia, which is a major port on the Mediterranean. So perhaps what Putin wants is a deal with Assad for a 50-year lease on the port of Latakia. Now that, to me, makes sense. That would explain why Putin is in Syria. It accomplishes a strategic thing for him. It gives him a port for his Mediterranean fleet. So I think that's probably part of the reason why I was successful. I feel uncomfortable saying successful because I don't feel successful. You tell me I was successful, but I don't feel successful. That's part of the modus operandi that I go through is I see disparate things and I try to make sense of them. For instance, another thing, when the third Kim took over North Korea, all of a sudden there was a huge round of executions, including his own uncle. He blew his uncle up with an anti-aircraft gun. Things were then fairly quiet, and then another big round of executions. I couldn't figure out why he was executing all these people. I contacted somebody who was an expert in North Korean relations, and I said, why all the executions? He said, well, there have been more than you know. They're just not publicized. There have been two big rounds. I thought, what's going on here? And then I saw something that said, Kim has not yet traveled outside of North Korea, not even to Beijing, to visit his sponsors. We don't know when Kim is going to travel outside of North Korea. All of a sudden, you put the two together. Perhaps the guy's afraid that if he leaves the country, he won't be able to come back, that there'll be a coup in his absence, and he's taking care of everybody who might be involved in such a coup. And in fact, he's now due to go to Moscow, I think, in December. So again, trying to make sense out of something, just looking around at how things might fit together to make things make more sense than they would otherwise. 30 years ago, a good friend of mine, also named Barbara McClintock, advised me over and over in our conversations that I should always question my fundamental assumptions, my underlying assumptions. And I think that's something that's been very important to me, was Barbara's advice. For instance, a spacecraft just flew past Jupiter and took a whole bunch of high-resolution pictures of Pluto, and took a whole bunch of high-resolution pictures of Pluto. And son of a gun, this 4.5 billion year old planet is geologically active. And everybody is absolutely floored. The solar system is 4.5 billion years old. The planets are not supposed to be geologically active when they're the size of Pluto. Why is this so? Everybody's trying to figure out why 4.5 billion year old Pluto is geologically active. They're talking about more missions to Pluto, $500 million missions, $500 million missions. I'm certain that there are all sorts of young planetary scientists who are trying to figure out how they can start their careers by figuring out and making a name for themselves why Pluto is geologically active. Well, what's the underlying assumption here? The underlying assumption is that Pluto's 4.5 billion years old. What happens if Pluto isn't 4.5 billion years old? What happens if Pluto's a good deal younger? Then, in fact, you expect it to be geologically active, and there's no inconsistency here at all. The inconsistency is that your fundamental assumption that Pluto is 4.5 billion years old was incorrect. So I'd advise those young planetary scientists who are thinking about trying to explain how a 4.5 billion year old celestial body could be geologically active to question whether or not it's really 4.5 billion years old. There's another something else that gets a lot more attention, and that's Iran. For the last 4 to 5 years, the entire economy of the world has been in an uproar because all of the major nations have slapped an embargo on dealing with Iran because Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. And they had to negotiate long and hard with Iran to negotiate Iran away from a posture where they could be capable of building the nuclear weapon that they were trying to build. And this brought us a lot closer to allies like Saudi Arabia, to whom we perhaps should not be close. And it's caused no end of trouble throughout the entire world, particularly the Middle East, which is troubled enough. Well, what's the underlying assumption here? That Iran wants to build a nuclear weapon. They kept saying that they didn't want to build a nuclear weapon. Why didn't we believe them? Well, we have X, Y, and Z reasons why we didn't believe them. But again, it's a fundamental assumption. The entire foreign policy in the Middle East of nearly the entire world was dictated by the underlying assumption that Iran wanted to build a nuclear device. I personally wouldn't want to build a nuclear device. I can't see why Iran would want a nuclear device. Nuclear bombs are so 20th century. We've moved on. I happen to think Iran didn't particularly want to build a nuclear bomb, but everybody's fundamental assumption was that it did. And I would go out on a limb and I'd say that even in spite of all the acrimony that we've had over Iran, that it's quite possible that in 20 years, Iran will be our closest ally in the Middle East. And the reason for that is that Iran is the largest Persian nation on earth. The United States is the second largest Persian nation on earth, and Canada is the fourth largest Persian nation on earth. There's a natural affinity there. And as soon as that embargo is lifted, the Persians are not going to start doing deals with the British or the Chinese or the Russians. They're going to do business with their Persian-American friends. So I see business between Iran, Persia, and the United States, particularly the Persian community, building very quickly. And I think that could lead to good political relations as well. That would be a major casualty of misunderstanding Iran's intentions with nuclear weapons. I'd recommend that when you come to a new field about which you know nothing, that you browse the literature, talk to people if you can, attend lectures if you can, and listen for the totem words, the words which either consciously or unconsciously people in the field give special meaning. And I find that if you can figure out what those totem words are and then go away and figure out what they mean, you'll find out at least one of the things that's very important to people in the field that they don't say is important to them necessarily, but they give it importance by continually using these totem words or continually emphasizing them. For instance, last week I went to grand rounds at our regional hospital, and there was a cardiologist giving a talk. And he was giving a talk on the pharmaceutical management of cardiac patients who had circulatory problems, problems with blockages, problems with leakages. He would go through a series of example patients. This patient comes in with these symptoms. What do? We immediately stent this patient. How do we drug this patient for the stent? We're going to use this compound and we're going to use this compound, but we're going to stay away from that compound because it can cause bleeding, and we don't want bleeding. Now, this patient has got a partially occluded artery and is in a lot of pain. We're going to give this patient warfarin because we need to dissolve that clot and prevent it from growing. However, we're not going to give this patient these other two drugs because they can lead to bleeding even worse than warfarin can lead to bleeding. We give combinations of these drugs because it reduces bleeding. Bleeding this, bleeding that. What I came away from, not knowing really that very much about how to treat cardiac patients, was that if we can generalize from just this one talk, what's most important is to keep the patient from bleeding no matter what you do. And so if I was given a new drug and asked to predict whether or not it was going to be a success, the first thing I'd look at is whether it causes uncontrolled bleeding or not, what the likelihood is, how it can be combined with other things, all from a standpoint of, does it cause bleeding? Now, that doesn't give you the answer to how that new drug is going to do, but it gives you a lead into it so that you can then begin to understand how things are going on. So I'd say look for the totem words. When you're reading an article, look for the words that the author of the article seems to come back to over and over, and then start by figuring out what those words mean. I've been very insecure all my life for a variety of reasons. And I never really thought very much of my own opinions. I always figured, well, is the world crazy or is it me? And the answer was, well, I must be crazy. I think the Good Judgment Project has shown me that occasionally I'm right and other people are wrong, which is not something that I expected going in. I expected to be wrong all the time. And curiously, and I've seen this in Phil's book and I've heard it from other people, the things about which I was most wrong were the things I was supposed to know something about, namely the medical questions. So I think the Good Judgment Project has given me a little bit of confidence in myself that I didn't have before I went into it.